I was 54 and living outside Savannah, Georgia, when the world I understood cracked in a way I could not name. My youngest son, Caleb, had been laid to rest just an hour earlier, and the air around my house felt strangely hollow, as if a storm had passed through every room and decided to stay. I sat in my study without turning on a single light, still wearing the same black funeral suit that carried the scent of wet grass, cold marble, and funeral lilies. My hands rested on the armrests, unmoving, as if grief had turned my body into heavy stone. Every corner of my home reminded me of Caleb, his boots by the back porch, his guitar leaning against my office door, the unfinished science project that still smelled like glue. Silence did not comfort me. It trapped me. I felt afraid of sound, afraid of memory, afraid of how death suddenly reduces everything you ever believed was permanent to a single moment of absence. I kept replaying the past few months in my mind, trying to understand why a healthy 17-year-old would collapse without warning. Doctors said cardiac failure, but those words never settled anywhere inside me. They simply hung in the air like a curtain trying to hide something I hadn't been allowed to see. Then my phone buzzed, a number from River Oaks High School glowing through the darkness. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, maybe a late condolence from a teacher who hadn't heard the news yet. But the voice on the other end was breathless, tense, and strangely urgent. The principal insisted that I come immediately and, more importantly, not inform anyone before arriving. Her tone did not sound like sympathy. It carried fear, the kind that makes your chest tighten before your mind catches up. She said she found something inside Caleb's school file. Something disturbing, something dangerous, something that could not wait another hour. Her words struck me harder than grief had all day. It felt as if death had not ended my suffering. It had just begun a second chapter one did not ask for. I stood up slowly, changed nothing about my clothes, and walked straight to my car like a man being pulled by a thread he could not see. The streets were empty, washed in the dull glow of streetlights that looked like distant lighthouses guiding me toward answers I never wanted. Every red light made me question if this was real or if grief was turning into paranoia. The school parking lot was abandoned, with only a single lamp near the entrance flickering like it wanted to go dark, but hadn't been given permission. My shoes echoed against the hallway tiles as I walked toward the principal's office, feeling as though each step was crossing into territory I could never return from. The principal stood behind her desk, pale, tense, holding her hands together like she had been waiting hours instead of minutes. She did not greet me or offer condolences. She simply looked toward the corner of the room. That was when I saw Mason, my eldest son, standing next to her. He should have been at home grieving with me, maybe resting, maybe watching old videos of Caleb like he always did when sadness overwhelmed him. Instead, Mason held a sealed administrative folder the way someone holds a tool or a weapon, or a key that unlocks secrets better left unopened. His expression did not show grief or exhaustion. It was unreadable, unnervingly composed, as if he had already accepted something I hadn't been allowed to understand yet. The principal kept her distance from both of us, like she was frightened of being too close to whatever truth the room was now carrying. In that moment, I felt my stomach twist painfully. Not from sadness, but from recognition. Something was wrong. Something was deeply wrong. And whatever was hidden in that file had the power to change the story I told myself about my own family, my own home, and my own loss. I didn't speak, and neither did Mason. His eyes stayed on the folder, not on me, not on the woman beside him. It was the first time I wondered if grief had not broken us, but revealed something that had been waiting in the shadows far longer than illness, funeral arrangements, or medical explanations. A truth that did not belong to death, but to the living. I reached for the nearest chair because standing suddenly felt dangerous, as though the ground itself could shift beneath my feet if I moved too quickly. Somewhere inside my chest, an instinct whispered that this night was not about condolences or school paperwork. It was the beginning of a story Caleb never lived long enough to finish, and Mason had already read ahead. Life after that night drifted into a rhythm that looked perfectly normal from the outside yet felt strangely hollow from within. Mason stayed close as if grief had given him a new identity: caretaker, organizer, decision-maker, curator of tragedy. He made coffee every morning before I could reach for the kettle, spoke to neighbors before I could raise my head, and answered condolence calls before I could find the strength to speak. People praised him for being so responsible, so composed, so supportive. The kind of son any grieving father would be proud of. No one noticed how effortlessly he placed himself between me and everything related to Caleb. Those early days felt like moving through soft fog. Mason carried boxes of Caleb's school papers into the den under the excuse of helping with legal matters, organizing medical receipts, filing insurance emails. He reassured everyone that he wanted to take the weight off my shoulders, and nobody doubted his generosity. It was easier for neighbors to see a helpful son than to question why every decision flowed through him. I wanted to believe he was simply being thoughtful, the way older siblings sometimes step up when tragedy hits, especially when a parent looks fragile. But something inside me knew this arrangement was not comforting. It was strangely suffocating. I noticed how Mason discouraged me from entering Caleb's room. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just a quiet suggestion, repeated often. "I'll organize it later. I'll handle the belongings when you're ready. You don't need to reopen those wounds." He moved through the house like he owned every emotional boundary. He treated my grief as delicate porcelain that might shatter if I took a single step without supervision. And honestly, some days I accepted it. Grief is heavy, and letting someone else carry the logistics felt like relief. Still, I found myself asking permission in my own home. Whenever neighbors visited with casseroles wrapped in foil, Mason greeted them with a calm smile, collecting sympathy like it belonged to him. I would sit in the den, hearing the faint murmur of condolences through the walls, the clinking of serving spoons on borrowed dishes. By the time Mason called me into the kitchen, the emotional part of every visit had already happened without me. I felt like I arrived late to my own loss, expected to nod politely and say thank you like a guest at a funeral reception he didn't organize. Mason's presence moved quietly from helpful to authoritative without making a sound. He updated Caleb's school records without consulting me. He contacted the funeral home about final paperwork without asking my opinion. He insisted on taking over all phone conversations with medical offices, claiming it would spare me from reliving details. And each time, I felt a small pulse of relief mixed with something darker, the feeling of losing private ownership over the grief that belonged to me as Caleb's father. Even decisions unrelated to Caleb began happening independently. Mason adjusted the thermostat, rearranged bills, handled property maintenance calls, and replaced my office printer without mentioning the old one had been discarded. He stood in doorways, speaking calmly, always polite, always measured, always professional. He looked like a man managing a business rather than a son mourning a brother. The strangest part? He never raised his voice, never acted aggressive, never broke character. His steadiness made any suspicion seem ungrateful, irrational, even cruel. How could I resent a son who was simply trying to help? But grief carries instincts sharper than logic. At night, when the house was silent and no casseroles sat cooling on the counter, I would replay Mason's movements in my mind. His composure felt unnatural. His proximity felt strategic. His kindness felt curated, like an image tailored for neighbors, pastors, insurance representatives, school officials, and every voice on the end of every call. Mason was grieving publicly and efficiently, while my grief remained private and wordless. The isolation became clearest when I realized I no longer knew what decisions were being made under my own roof. Some days I would walk into the kitchen and find my refrigerator reorganized, the pantry labeled, and Caleb's personal belongings stacked into neat plastic containers. I never witnessed Mason moving anything. It always happened at times when the house felt asleep or when I stepped outside to sit on the porch and breathe air thick with magnolia and humidity. I caught myself apologizing whenever I interfered, apologizing for asking to keep a sweater, apologizing for wanting to read an old notebook, apologizing for needing a moment alone with Caleb's belongings. That was when fear touched me for the first time. Grief had made me compliant, gentle, and numb. Mason had made me silent. One afternoon, I overheard him on the phone with extended family. They asked how I was coping, and he answered for me as if he were my legal guardian. He described me as fragile, unable to think clearly, and too overwhelmed to manage sensitive matters. His tone was soft, sympathetic, and admirably composed. He painted a picture of a grieving father so broken that no one should burden me with questions or decisions. It sounded selfless, until I recognized what silence it created around me. People stopped calling to ask how I was. They called to ask Mason. People stopped asking what I wanted. They asked Mason what I needed. People stopped seeing me as a father grieving his son. They saw Mason as the central figure of this tragedy, the spokesperson, the executor, the interpreter of my emotional capacity. I sat on the edge of my bed that evening and stared at the window where dusk settled like a heavy curtain. I began to understand that isolation is not always loud, dramatic, or violent. Sometimes it arrives disguised as competence, organization, and unwavering calm. Sometimes it feels like surrender disguised as comfort. And sometimes, painfully, slowly, you realize a person close to you is not easing your suffering. They are quietly moving you to the perimeter of your own life. Grief eventually became something I could move through without trembling. But suspicion became something I could not escape. One morning, while Mason was out on a bank meeting, I walked down the hallway toward Caleb's bedroom. I paused at the door, feeling shame for crossing a boundary my own son had subtly established, yet unable to ignore the unease that had been growing inside me like a slow infection. The room looked untouched, preserved almost lovingly. Framed photographs on the dresser, track medals hanging from thumbtacks, neatly folded laundry on the chair. Mason had kept everything clean, orderly, controlled, as if grief came with a maintenance schedule. The air smelled faintly of Caleb's cologne, something citrusy and bright that felt painfully alive. My knees weakened the moment I stepped inside, not from emotion alone but from the certainty that I needed to search, not mourn. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I could no longer trust the narrative I had been given. I opened drawers one by one, notebooks, loose homework sheets, crumpled movie tickets, a jar of coins, the ordinary things of teenage life. Every object reminded me of a world without danger, a world where the worst thing that could happen was a bad grade or a missed curfew. Nothing looked sinister, nothing suggested fear or illness. Part of me almost felt foolish. Then instinct nudged me toward the bed. I lifted the mattress slowly, expecting nothing more than dust bunnies or lost socks. Instead, I found a spiral notebook, worn around the edges, tucked flat against the bed frame like something intentionally hidden. I hesitated before touching it, feeling as though reading it would trespass into my son's private anxieties. But I also knew that innocence never hides itself under mattresses. The early entries were mundane class schedules, reminders about history quizzes, notes on summer jobs. Then the tone changed. Caleb began documenting physical fatigue and unexplained headaches, scribbled descriptions of nausea, tremors, dizziness, body aches, blurred vision. He wrote about struggling to concentrate and falling asleep during classes. He chalked it up to stress, late-night studying, growing pains, hormones, anything that felt harmless. But as the pages progressed, the symptoms intensified. What unsettled me most was the consistency. Every worsening cycle matched a moment when Caleb mentioned taking supplements that Mason encouraged him to use for energy, focus, and exam performance. Caleb seemed grateful at first, writing that Mason cared enough to find health boosters. But the entries soon twisted into quiet fear. Waking up with rapid heartbeat, needing more water than usual, sudden waves of overheating, pain in the chest he described as lightning behind my ribs. He wrote that Mason told him the side effects were temporary and a sign that the supplements were working on his metabolism. Caleb trusted him. Why wouldn't he? He idolized Mason more than he idolized any coach or teacher. Mason had always been charismatic, persuasive, academically gifted, the type of older brother a younger sibling believes without hesitation. One entry forced me to sit down. Caleb described a bottle with no manufacturer label, only strange alphanumeric markings that looked coded rather than branded. He wrote that the pills tasted bitter and metallic, unlike anything sold in stores. He asked Mason where he got them, but Mason told him not to worry, that he used them in college and they helped him stay laser-focused. Underneath that paragraph, Caleb wrote one final line. Sometimes I wonder if I should stop, but Mason says it's safe. And Mason never lies. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest as if holding it could protect me from what I had just learned. The realization arrived not as a dramatic lightning strike, but as a slow tightening of the lungs. Mason was involved in Caleb's physical decline. Whether intentional or reckless or something darker, I could not yet name. But intent no longer mattered. Cause mattered. And the cause lived under my roof, acting like a grieving son offering emotional shelter. A sudden creak from the hallway snapped me back into the present. My first instinct was not to grieve or confront. It was to flee. I tucked the notebook under my jacket and slipped through Caleb's open window, stepping into the backyard like a man escaping his own house. Grass clung to my trousers, and the humid Georgia morning wrapped around me like a fever. I stood behind the oak tree long enough to feel my heartbeat move from panic to clarity. I understood something I had not been willing to consider before. Grief had made me blind, not weak. Mason's constant presence, his careful management of every detail, his subtle orchestration of isolation. None of that was accidental. It was preparation. And suddenly, the line between personal tragedy and personal threat sharpened. I did not call Mason or confront him. I did not try to analyze motives or morality. I only knew that every minute of ignorance served his advantage, not mine. Caleb had documented his suffering meticulously, but not because he feared Mason. Caleb trusted Mason more than he trusted his own body's warning signals. He believed he was safe. That trust was fatal. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in my truck behind the old pecan orchard, rereading every page of that notebook. Each symptom became a bruise on my mind. Each dated entry became a timestamp on betrayal. Each moment of Caleb's confusion became a moment of my awakening. The innocence of my family ended somewhere in those pages. I no longer felt like a grieving father. I felt like a man standing at the edge of a truth that would destroy the last pieces of a life he thought he understood. And whatever explanation Mason had, sentimental, financial, experimental, manipulative, no answer would restore the son I lost. But evidence would be my only language from that moment forward. I started the engine and drove toward town, the notebook resting on the passenger seat like a small, wounded witness no one had expected to speak. I understood two things with brutal certainty. Caleb had died believing Mason was trying to help him, and Mason had positioned himself as the grieving hero before Caleb's body was even cold. That realization changed everything inside me. It snuffed out the naive belief that tragedy had brought our family closer, and it replaced it with something far more unsettling. Tragedy had given someone in this family exactly what they wanted. Grief used to make me move slowly, like my bones were filled with wet sand. But after reading Caleb's notebook, my body felt different, alert, electric, purposeful. I no longer drifted through rooms like a stunned parent waiting for condolences. I moved like a man studying a crime scene he once mistook for a home. I didn't confront Mason. Confrontation gives warning, and warning gives time. Instead, I drove to the riverfront where no one would recognize my truck. Mason had taken control of our household so effectively that the safest place to think was anywhere outside of it. The sun hung low over the reeds, shadows sliding across the water like dark ribbons, and I sat on the hood of the truck with the notebook open again, committing every detail to memory. Grief asks for emotion. Evidence asks for stillness. Only one person had enough professional distance to see clearly. My longtime accountant and family advisor, Joel Harper. I trusted Joel not because he was sentimental, he was the opposite. He believed numbers more than people, documents more than emotional stories, and quiet investigation more than loud accusation. If anyone could help me trace a motive embedded in financial decisions, it would be him. But I could not meet Joel at his office or anywhere Mason might expect. Mason had access to my schedule, my email, and my voicemail, and he handled family business calls as if he were authorized by birthright. I chose a location no one would think to question. A condemned boathouse near the riverbank, unlocked, dust-coated, its windows boarded but still letting in thin strips of light like hesitant confessions. Joel arrived with the same leather briefcase he'd carried for 20 years, the same calm stride, the same quiet neutrality. I explained nothing verbally at first. I simply placed Caleb's notebook on a crate between us, open to the entries describing symptoms and strange pills. Joel read without emotional reaction. No shock, no sympathy, just analysis. The kind of silence that separates grief from data. By the time he reached the final pages, his expression sharpened rather than softened. He closed the notebook slowly, as if collecting himself before speaking. I told him I needed two things: discreet verification and untouched access to anything Mason might be hiding. Joel understood immediately. He had known Mason since childhood and always admired the discipline and ambition that made him appear like the perfect successor to the family real estate business. But Joel also knew ambition without boundaries can grow teeth. Discretion first. Joel helped me search for quiet proof, not by breaking into accounts or forcing access, but by exploiting digital remnants Mason had forgotten existed. Years earlier, before Mason moved into adulthood and self-importance, our entire family shared a cloud storage login for convenience. No one used it anymore, or so Mason believed. Joel retrieved the old login credentials from paper records stored in his office basement, untouched since a roofing leak nearly ruined them. The cloud folder was enormous: years of school essays, taxes, photographs, spreadsheets, legal drafts, business correspondence. Mason had likely assumed it was obsolete. He had built newer accounts, newer clouds, newer platforms, confident that the old one no longer mattered. But digital clutter never truly dies. It just waits for someone patient enough to sift through it. Joel and I combed through subfolders, mundane files at first: college lecture notes, transcripts, internship contracts. Then the tone shifted. We uncovered confidential email exchanges between Mason and a laboratory technician in Brunswick. The language was unsettlingly clinical. Discussion of slow-acting compounds, formulas, payment schedules, controlled shipments, and something described as long-range metabolic leverage. Mason had paid thousands of dollars through untraceable transfers that were intentionally broken into micropayments to avoid regulatory detection. The technician requested patient logs, not medical records, but observable effects: energy fluctuations, cognitive changes, appetite shifts, sleep irregularities, tremors. The emails described dosage adjustments and response thresholds, and repeatedly referenced subject stability. Mason had been gathering data, and Caleb had been the subject. Nothing in the emails used Caleb's name directly, only coded initials and numerical identifiers. But the dates aligned perfectly with the timeline in Caleb's notebook. The physiological symptoms matched word for word. Each worsening cycle coincided with financial transfers from Mason. No jury would need more than that pattern. And then came the part that hollowed out my chest rather than inflaming it. Mason also discussed a strategic business split, contingent on incapacity of primary owner, meaning me. They discussed transferring partial executive authority to Mason with justification supported by observed instability of elder family member. Elder. Not grieving. Not overwhelmed. Elder. Mason had presented grief not as tragedy but as opportunity. The language in the documents was cold, clinical, transactional, no sentiment, no hesitation. As if family did not exist outside of leverage. As if death and incapacity were merely logistical hurdles in asset division. Joel suggested something I would never have considered in my old life: quiet surveillance. Not confrontation, not accusations, not emotional appeals. The truth needed to come from Mason's own mouth, not just from digital corroboration. Georgia is a one-party consent state for recording, and nothing is more persuasive than a person casually revealing motive in a space they believe to be safe. We placed a small recording device inside the built-in bookshelf of Mason's home office, an area he used frequently, often for late-night calls with out-of-state investors. Mason never noticed its placement because grief had turned the house into a theater where he assumed every observer was blind. Joel instructed me to stay calm, predictable, undramatic. The goal was to gather, not expose. Exposure without preparation is emotion. Preparation without exposure is strategy. Over the next several evenings, the recorder captured fragments that slowly formed a whole. Mason discussing timing, controlling narratives, managing perceptions, and accelerating generational transition. He described me as weak and impressionable, not in a tone of resentment but in a tone of strategic positioning. His voice was steady, unhurried, confident, like a man giving a PowerPoint presentation to the universe. In one recording, Mason described Caleb's passing not with heartbreak but with relief. Tragedy expedited restructuring, he said, as if loss were a fiscal mechanism rather than the death of a 17-year-old boy. That sentence did not ignite rage. It extinguished something far more permanent, the belief that grief and ambition cannot occupy the same bloodstream. From that moment on, I no longer felt like a father at the mercy of tragedy. I felt like a witness building a case against someone who believed family bonds were currency, and death was a catalyst. And I understood something sobering, something absolutely unshakable. Mason had not lost a brother. He had removed an obstacle. The night of the Savannah Harbor Investors Banquet arrived with the same polished elegance it carried every year: polished marble floors, champagne flutes, glittering lighting fixtures, and a room full of real estate executives who treated wealth like oxygen. It was an event my family business had sponsored for nearly 2 decades, long before Caleb was born, back when Mason still wore braces and read stock market magazines like comic books. This banquet had always been a celebration of legacy, endurance, community investment, and quiet pride. But this year, grief cast a different kind of shadow. Mason requested to be the keynote speaker, framing it as an honor to Caleb's memory and a moment to show resilience. People admired the sentiment. He shook hands, accepted condolences, told every investor we were moving through the pain with dignity and unity. His voice held just enough tremor to seem fragile, and just enough confidence to seem inspiring. He was playing both roles, surviving brother and rising executive. The ballroom applauded him not just for surviving tragedy, but for stepping into leadership as if fate had finally chosen him. No one knew that fate had been manufactured weeks before the funeral. I wore a dark suit that felt heavier than my skin. I did not drink, though champagne floated through the room like invitations to forget. I stood alone near the edge of the crowd, watching Mason glide from table to table with the precision of a man rehearsing politics rather than processing grief. Every handshake looked like confirmation. Every smile looked like consolidation. Every sympathetic nod from investors looked like a transfer of loyalty. Mason had positioned himself as the future. Every conversation assumed I was fading into retirement, stepping away, exhausted, emotionally unfit, a grieving father unable to hold the reins of a multimillion-dollar company. And in a certain way, he had curated that assumption. He had described me privately as overwhelmed, indecisive, unstable. People believed him because grief looks like instability even when it isn't. All I needed was the right room, the right moment, and the right silence. When the lights dimmed and the stage illuminated, Mason took his place at the podium. His tribute to Caleb was flawless: tender memories, softened anecdotes, a few strategic pauses that drew sympathetic sighs from the audience. He portrayed himself as a devoted brother who held Caleb's hand through academic stress, health concerns, and senior year uncertainty. He became the hero in a tragedy that did not require a hero. People dabbed their eyes with napkins. He stood there absorbing grief as if it were currency. Then he shifted into business, discussing the company's future. Aggressive market expansion, new suburban developments, rising valuations, and the importance of continuity. Investors leaned forward like attentive disciples. Mason had the charisma of someone who believed he already owned the room. He expected applause. He expected endorsement. He expected me to smile, clasp his shoulder, and announce my official transition out of leadership. He had built an entire narrative around inevitability. I waited until the projector operator nodded to signal readiness. Joel had overseen every technical detail. No confrontation, no raised voice, no emotional declarations. Just truth presented the same way Mason presented ambition. Clean, quiet, documented. When my turn was called, I walked toward the stage without expression. Mason stepped aside, expecting a eulogy, maybe a sentimental closing remark about unity and healing. He watched me with the calm pride of a man certain his public ascension was complete. But instead of speaking, I pressed a small remote. The ballroom screen blinked once. Then Caleb's handwriting appeared across 30 feet of projected white. A page from his notebook, dated, detailed, aching, describing headaches, tremors, nausea, blurred vision, and the coded supplements Mason encouraged him to take for academic performance. The audience fell into absolute stillness. Every letter on the screen suddenly felt heavier than grief, heavier than legal jargon, heavier than any business forecast Mason had discussed moments earlier. I did not narrate. I did not explain. I allowed the room to read. Page after page appeared. Symptoms worsening after each dosage. Caleb's confusion, Caleb's trust, Caleb's fear he could not name aloud because he did not want to disappoint his older brother. Mason froze, no longer able to smile. Then the projection shifted from handwriting to email archives. Digital threads between Mason and the Brunswick lab technician, discussing compounds, tracking physical effects, scheduling microtransfers, and referencing subject conformity. Every word appeared on the screen like a confession typed long before tragedy became convenient. Still no voiceover, no accusation, just text, structured, undeniable, chronological. The audience watched ambition dismantle its disguise without a single sentence from me. Then came the audio. A recording captured in Mason's office, his voice clear and casual, discussing timing, narrative control, accelerated restructuring, and strategic advantage after incapacity. He used the word incapacity with the detachment of someone discussing office supplies. He spoke about Caleb's death not with sorrow but with relief. Tragedy expedited restructuring. People in the ballroom did not gasp. They didn't need to. Silence became its own verdict. Mason took one step toward me, then stopped, realizing movement in that moment would make him visible in ways he no longer understood how to disguise. Investors stared at him the way people study a stranger who has removed a familiar mask. I didn't speak. I didn't turn toward him. I didn't raise my voice or accuse him of anything. Truth didn't need my anger. It needed clarity. At the back of the ballroom, local sheriff's deputies, invited quietly hours earlier, stood with arms crossed, watching the same information as everyone else. They didn't take Mason away in handcuffs at that moment. Public arrest isn't always tactical. Evidence needed processing. Statements needed formal structure. But the deputies left the ballroom with copies of everything. Notebook scans, financial documentation, email logs, and full audio files. Mason's social currency collapsed in real time. People who had applauded him minutes earlier now stared at him without blinking. Not in shock, not in pity, but in a cold, analytical stillness reserved for those who have weaponized grief for personal gain. I stepped away from the podium and walked toward the exit without looking back. Not a single person stopped me. Not one investor asked questions. Not one colleague tried to comfort me or confront me. They all understood the weight of what they had witnessed. Not tragedy, not family dysfunction, not rumor, just evidence. No noise, no argument, no dramatic confrontation. The narrative Mason had curated for months dissolved under the weight of truth spoken in documents rather than emotion. Outside, the air was heavy with humidity and river mist, carrying the faint smell of brine and magnolia. I stood under an oak archway and took my first full breath in weeks. It didn't heal anything, but it felt clean, honest, unmanipulated. Grief finally had room to exist without strategy pressed against its back. For the first time since Caleb died, my sorrow belonged only to me. Not curated, not supervised, not measured for optics.